Good evening from Manila. Good morning to those joining from North America, and a warm afternoon greetings to those joining from Europe and Central Asia. Thank you for joining and welcome to the regional consultation on different financing modalities. This is the 20th and the last set of regional consultations uh, during the phase two of the Safeguards Policy and Review Update at Asian Development Bank. My name is Gelson Garcia, your overall moderator. This consultation is with the stakeholders in North America and Europe. 73 stakeholders from 20 countries registered in today's session. 56 are from non-ADB network. A special mention to countries represented here, including Canada and United States from North America, Belgium, Germany, Hungary, Netherlands, Switzerland, and United Kingdom from Europe. And we're also joined by participants from Europe and Central Asia, East Asia, South Asia, Southeast Asia. So I think we have those participants from across regional operations of the bank. Now, since the start of the phase two consultations in November 2021, we have engaged government, civil society organizations, international organizations, project affected people, the private sector groups, issue-based organizations, including indigenous people, members from the Sogiesk community, and other issue-based groups. So with your participation, you are now adding to more than 3,200 stakeholders that we have engaged since November 2021. Now, the financing modalities is a very, very important topic in the review process. And in this consultation, we will discuss the lessons learned from the application of safeguard requirements for different types of financing modalities of projects supported by ADB and partners. We will also discuss the proposed issues for consideration in ADB's revised safeguards policy that deal with the sovereign and private sector lending in other financial services. A big chunk of our consultation today is the interactive discussion with you, and we have prepared a few framing questions to get your inputs. Now, before I call on our speakers, here's a few gentle meeting reminders. Please join from a quiet, distraction-free area. Turn off your mic when you're not speaking. And during Q&A, you may ask questions by typing them in the chat box or raising your hand. You will then be asked to unmute and turn on your camera so you can ask your question live. Be respectful to everyone. We will manage time to keep with our schedule. And as you're joining by Zoom, here's a few guidance when using important buttons. In this session, we're using English. We ask that you use your proper name in Zoom for our documentation. To change your name on Zoom, click on the participant's bottom at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and on the right hand of your screen, look for your name and then click on the More button on the right side of your name. Click on the Rename button, type in your name and agency, then click OK. If you wish to send a message, question, or feedback, click the chat button and we will have our colleagues who will respond to you. And if you wish to comment or raise a question live in the language you prefer, click on the smile icon and then click on raise hand. To speak and unmute yourself, click on the microphone icon, and to show your video, click on the video icon. We value diverse and informed feedback, so let me restate the safeguards ADB has put in to ensure that we keep having meaningful consultations. The consultation allows all stakeholders to provide opportunities to express your views and opinions on ADB's environmental and social safeguards in the most meaningful and safest manner possible. All stakeholders are encouraged to articulate your inputs and concerns during these consultations. By joining these sessions, you are consenting to the video and audio recording of these consultations for their subsequent release. If you wish to exclude yourselves from such recordings, you can ask the Safeguard Policy Review and Update Secretariat at safeguardsupdate@adb.org within 2 weeks of this session to share your exceptions and exclusions. The recordings would allow ADB to review, consider, and respond to, if necessary, any comments and inputs made. Background materials on the thematic areas have been released prior to this consultation. All types of feedback are welcome. This will not be used for the purposes of retaliation, abuse, or any other kind of discrimination. And if you have any issues or concerns on the disclosure, recording, confidentiality, potential risks, abuse, or any kind of discrimination during the consultations, or wish to exclude yourself from the recording of events and discussions, please contact us at the email safeguardsupdate@adb.org. Now, in this consultation, we have 2.5 hours, and here's the proposed flow of our consultation. We'll begin with Mr. Bruce Dunn, the Director of Safeguards Division of ADB's Sustainable Development and Climate Change Department, or SDCC for short, to provide welcome remarks, an overview of Safeguards Policy Review and Update, including what we have already achieved in the phase 2 of the consultation. Ms. Zara Abbas will follow. She is the Principal Environment Specialist of the SDCC, and she will begin the first session, which is an overview and findings of the analytical study on safeguards in different financing modalities, and with the focus on the sovereign financing modalities. Then before we go to another presentation, we'll have the first moderated discussion to get your feedback, and we will have Mr. Duncan Lang, the Senior Environment Specialist, to moderate the Q&A, and we have 35 minutes for that. We'll have a 5-minute break. Then when we return, we will have Mr. Felix Oku, the Senior Social Development Specialist, who will lead his presentation in the private sector operations and the financing modalities, including, we would assume, the discussion on financial intermediary, which is one of the 3 major modalities under private sector operations. Then we will have the second moderated discussion, again, moderated by Mr. Duncan Lang. We will then have a very, very quick event evaluation to get your feedback on the process and how we can further improve the consultation, as we will be transitioning to the phase 3 of the review process, and then we will have a wrap by Director Dunn. So again, thank you for joining. I will now call on Mr. Director Dunn to begin his overview. Bruce, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you very much, Jelson, and good day to everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today, wherever you're joining from. Really appreciate you coming. I know, looking at the participants list, that many of you have joined our consultation program before, and always appreciate people coming back to that. We've done a lot of different thematic studies and consultation events. As Jelson mentioned, this is the 20th topic that we've actually run consultations on, plus we've been doing in-country consultations with civil society and our developing member countries. So we've had a lot of events, and it's been great to have the feedback from everyone. So welcome today for this session on the financing modalities. A lot of the conversations that we've had so far have really been focused on more traditional project financing. and looking at various environmental and social standards, a whole range of technical topics. Today, we're wanting to cover the quite wide diversity of different financing modalities that ADB has. This ranges from things like our policy-based lending to support our member countries with making policy reforms, counter-cyclical financing, which has been used quite a lot in times of economic crisis, including in the recent COVID-19 pandemic, to provide budget and financing support for countries to be able to address some of the economic impacts of those crises. We've got financial intermediaries, results-based lending, and a range of other modalities that we use also in the sovereign sector with governments, programmatic financing, such as something we call multi-tranche financing facilities and sector loans. There's a whole range. And today, what we'd like to do is give you a bit of an overview. We've got a couple of presentations which will give you some background on those different financing modalities and talk about how we're currently doing the safeguards for them and some of the issues that we think we need to address in the new policy. We have already been receiving quite a bit of feedback and suggestions on different modalities, and I'm sure today you will have your questions and recommendations. But before going into the presentations, I wanted to just spend a couple of minutes to make sure that everyone has the same information about the process and the way that we're approaching things with the new safeguards. I think most of you have joined sessions before, but perhaps there's a couple of people that haven't joined previous sessions. So let me go to just a couple of slides, and then I'll pass to my colleagues to go into some of the details. What you'll see on this slide is an overview of the approach and methodology, and I'll just give a few highlights here. First, I think most of you will know that we had an independent evaluation undertaken on our safeguards in 2020, and that recommended that we should update and modernize the policy. That was sort of a springboard for moving us forward, and we prepared an approach paper and a stakeholder engagement plan. We then moved into all of these studies and consultations that I mentioned, and we're now down in the third phase of the policy preparation. We've been focusing the last few months on getting the first draft prepared, and we're doing a lot of internal consultations on that at the moment in ADB. We've been developing the overall framework, but we're now coming to do some work on the financing modalities. The timetable at the moment is we're aiming to have the first draft, the first full draft of the policy available for circulation to the public. We'll be putting that up on our website and also sharing it with stakeholders. We're expecting to do that before ADB's annual meeting in May. So it's coming up pretty soon in the next couple of months. After that, we'll have some further consultation with ADB's board, and we're looking to take a working paper with the first draft to the board by July. After that, we'll go into a phase of more consultations on the draft. You know, you'll have the draft in your hand marked up with various questions and comments, and we'll then have a series of additional consultations before aiming to take the final paper to our board next year, most likely in the first quarter by about March next year. So that gets us a new policy approved, but we need to have some time after that to prepare for the rollout. We're looking to have the policy become effective 12 months after approval. And during that time, we'll be doing a lot of work in training our own staff and building capacity with our clients and member countries, and we'll be doing further work on the preparation of guidance notes. So that's the approach. And then if we go to the next slide, you'll see here, this is the list of the consultation topics we've done. These are all available on our website, along with the consultation materials, well, the studies themselves, the consultation materials, and actually recordings of previous sessions. So that's there. If we then go to the next slide, I'll just give you a bit of an overview in terms of the structure of the policy that we're looking at. You'll see there's a number of levels. We start off with some strategic visioning in the policy. We'll have an ADB policy vision statement, which articulates how the policy will support global agendas like the Sustainable Development Goals and the Paris Agreement on climate change, amongst others, as well as how we deliver on ADB's own strategy, what we call our Strategy 2030. We then go into, if you look at the second level down on the slide, an ADB environmental and social policy. That sets out the overall policy objectives, and we've got a range of different requirements and responsibilities for the ADB. So this is where we set out what we need to do from risk categorization and monitoring and supervision. Then on the same level, there'll be a set of environmental and social standards. We're looking at this stage to have a set of 10 standards which would apply to projects. And then linking that together, we will have some special requirements for different financing modalities. You'll see that there ringed in red in the middle of the screen. So you've got a policy, you've got a set of standards, and then you've got special requirements for different financing modalities. Now you'll see some MDBs like the IFC or the World Bank have got a standard on financial intermediaries. We will have financial intermediaries covered, but we'll also have requirements for other financing modalities. So it's a little bit broader than you may have seen in say, the IFC or the World Bank. Then we will have more of our procedural materials for ADB, our own operations manual and staff instructions. And then we will have a whole series of guidance and training materials to support the overall program. So that's the structure. And today, what my colleagues will be doing is, as I said, running through the different financing modalities. And then we'll be looking forward to having some discussions and recommendations from you. And as this process is still ongoing, we'll be able to consider your recommendations and feed those into the further drafting process. So with that, again, thank you so much for joining. And let me pass back to Gelson. Thank you.
Thank you, Bruce. So I will now pass the floor to Zara. Zara.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Justin. Thank you, Bruce. Good morning to everybody in North America, Europe, and good day. So I will be briefly walking you through the presentation, which is in two parts. I'll present the findings on the study that we undertook for different financing modalities. I'm going to focus on those modalities that ADB normally uses for sovereign lending, and my colleague will deal with the other ones, which are for the private sector. So, and we'll, can I have the next slide, please? Then I'll just start there. Thank you. So, the study was based on a desk review of the different financing modalities. And in addition to that, we looked at some of, there are some ADB's Independent Evaluation Department studies, which the IED undertook for the different financing modalities. And wherever they were available, we looked at those. And then we also looked at our ADB's own experience in implementing them. And also, so this together gave us some insights and some lessons, and identified some issues that we plan to incorporate or factor into the new policy that we are working on these days. And next slide, please. So in addition to the project loan, which is the one that's used most popular, ADB has a number of their financing modalities and financial instruments that we use for financing projects and for our developing member countries. And these include the program loan, sector financing, the multi-tranche financing facility, emergency assistance loans, and other instruments such as financial intermediary support and corporate finance. So at the moment, the SPS has an annex called Safeguards Requirements 4, which outlines the special requirements for the different financing modalities, because the SPS also covers all financing modalities, and the new framework that we are working on will also apply to all financing modalities that ADB has. Next slide, please. So the slide has a lot of description and a lot of text on it. Essentially, it gives a description of the modality itself and what the safeguards requirements are for that modality and what issues we are looking at for consideration. So I'm just going to run through this briefly and not go into all the details. The sector loan, you may be familiar with this, is used for covering sector type projects, which are where we don't have a clear idea of how many projects will be financed and what they would be and exactly where, but we know that they are in a sector. So in such a case, what is done is that sample projects are taken and under the SPS, sample projects are identified, and the safeguards assessment is undertaken for that sample project, and a framework is prepared that sort of guides which is supposed to guide the borrower in how to undertake the safeguards assessments for the subsequent projects, which will actually happen later. So the study that we undertook helped us identify some issues for consideration, and I'll just touch on those over here. So given the nature of sector loans with multiple sub-projects, then there's what we think under the new policy is that the risk classification approach that we're going to be following now can be made to focus on the broader safeguards implications within the sector. And at an early stage when we're scoping, at that stage, this can provide better guidance to the borrower in selecting the appropriate environmental and social assessment tool, such as possibly a strategic environmental assessment or a cumulative impact assessment, depending on the scale of that or the geographic scope of that sector loan. And also, in addition to that, the longer time commitment of a sector loan also can provide a good opportunity for capacity building of the borrower or the client. Next slide, please. So here we're going to just look at the multi-tranche financing facility. So it's very similar to a sector loan, but the difference is that it's not for one sector; it can be multi-sector, and it has a fixed time period of 10 years. And sub-projects are identified at the beginning, and we are aware of what the sub-projects are going to be. So safeguards assessments are undertaken for the first tranche project, and for the rest of them, a framework is prepared to identify how to approach safeguards assessments in the subsequent tranches. And the results of the first tranche are factored in. So here also what we saw was that the longer time commitment of the MFF provides an opportunity to address some safeguards issues that may be problematic or that are complex. And so there's a sufficient time to address those issues over the lifetime of the MFF. So this is an opportunity that we can incorporate into the new policy. And also, again, the risk assessment approach that we are going to be using for the new policy can be used to broaden the scale, broaden across the scale of the entire MFF. And instead of looking at the risks just of one project, we should factor in the risks of how the whole MFF would be affected. And then also specific criteria can be used or can be developed for assessing certain sector-specific risks, which could be important in such a case. And also at the scoping stage, the appropriate environmental social assessment tool can be identified either if a strategic assessment is appropriate or a cumulative assessment is appropriate in addition to an environmental social assessment, then this approach of risk assessment can be very useful in for such a modality. And also because of the long-term commitment and a clear idea of what the sub-projects are, the capacity building can also be focused and can be spread across the entire MFF for the implementing agency. And also the lessons from the previous tranches can be useful and should be incorporated. So next slide, please. So policy-based lending is a form of sovereign budget support or a sovereign guarantee that supports policy reforms and development expenditure programs for a developing member country, and may be used to provide balance of payments assistance or counter-cyclical fiscal support. So some issues that can be considered in the new policy are that, again, the risk classification process is something which can be applied to identify the social and environmental risks at the policy level. So under the present SPS, for a policy loan, we require that the borrower should assess the policy actions and identify what impacts can occur. So since policies can be, it's not very clear of what kind of investments can result, it is often not very easy, or it's not possible to identify these impacts clearly. So now, because of the risk-based approach and through a comprehensive guidance which will be developed for this, it will be possible to identify what sort of or what type of impacts and risks are likely through policy actions. So that can be, so we can identify contextual risks that can come into play and affect the risk classification of an investment. So this can also then again help in to identify the appropriate environmental social assessment that should be undertaken for certain types of risks resulting from policy actions. So next slide, please. Now, the emergency assistance loan is used as a quick or a rapid form of assistance to a developing member country in the case of any natural disasters or any financial emergencies, and mostly is followed is preceded by a disaster needs assessment. So the safeguards requirements, there is a risk that the safeguards requirements may not be followed properly, and because of the emergency situation, it's important to disburse or to provide that assistance to a developing member country immediately. So in order to do that, the emergency loan has the flexibility of at the beginning, at the time of processing of that loan, a framework needs to be prepared. And once the loan is approved, then between the approval and the time that the project is constructed is implemented, the safeguards assessments need to be undertaken in that time period. So what is very important for such a loan, which we have learned and we would want to incorporate into the new policy, is a very strong and robust monitoring and reporting system, so that we can ensure that the safeguards assessments are undertaken and are implemented appropriately and properly. So next slide, please. Now, the results-based lending, or the RBL, is basically a type of financing that a type of loan that finances a share of a government's or a program. If there's an ongoing program, or at either the national level or the subnational or provincial or sector level, then an RBL loan can finance a part of that. So in this case, under the present policy, for the implementation purposes, and the national systems and institutions are used. And but here the disbursement of funds is linked with the achievement of results. So now this RBL modality, for this purpose, and the RBL policy was approved by ADB's board in 2019, and this followed a 6-year pilot period in which this was tested, and then whatever lessons were learned from that were used to strengthen the approach for the RBL. So now for the RBL, program, since national systems are used, an assessment of the national safeguard systems is undertaken first. And if there are any gaps between that and ADB's requirements, then a gap filling actions are also identified. And then that program system assessment, which and the gap filling actions are together followed and monitored through the implementation of the RBL. Now, when the RBL policy was approved, we already looked at certain elements to strengthen the criteria for eligibility of the activities. And for this purpose, already the programmatic and institutional and contextual risks were factored into that. So, excuse me, just a minute. Sorry about that. My dog was suddenly trying to make himself comfortable here. Sorry about that. So, so for this purpose, institutional and contextual risks are factored into this, and also the commitment and capacity of the borrower to manage the impacts and risks that are identified. So what we've seen in this pilot period and since 2019 is that the readiness of our developing member countries for results-based lending implementation is still low, and a lot of support is still needed, and in terms of training for the DMCs in preparing that program systems assessment, basically an assessment of the systems, and for identifying and implementing gap-filling actions. So what we for this modality also, we feel that there's a need to strengthen the monitoring systems and as part of the new procedures for this modality. Next slide, please. Now, technical assistances and project preparation modalities can be either grants or can also be loans. So traditionally, ADB has technical assistances, which are either knowledge improving knowledge, and also for preparing projects. And there are also loans, which are project readiness facilities or small expenditure facilities, financing facilities, which are used to finance the detailed feasibility studies or detailed design of projects, and also to undertake, in some cases, also the safeguards assessments for a project that would then follow. So at the moment, for these technical assistances or project preparation facilities, there are no safeguards requirements because they don't result in actual projects. When the project does happen in the future, then safeguards classification takes place, and safeguards requirements kick in at that stage. But at this stage, if there's a project in mind, then that category of the project is kept in mind, and proportion to that, then an environmental social impact assessment or resettlement planning documents are prepared. So, so in this case, this is mostly to improve the readiness of the borrower for a certain project. So that's the last one of my slides. Thank you so much, and hand it back to Jelson now for the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you, Zara. I hope that your dog gets comfortable now.
Yes. Sorry.
All right. So thank you for walking us through the different financing modalities. I know it's a lot to absorb. We have the sector loans, we have the multi-tranche financing facilities, policy-based lending, emergency assistance loan, results-based lending, and technical assistance. It may be new to some, but I know many in the audience of the participants are well familiar about many of these financing modalities. So, and it's good that you have described them in terms of what safeguards are required under the current policy and the issues that are being considered for the new policy. And that's where we would like to get the feedback from the participants. So I hope that we have provided greater clarity to inform our moderated discussion. So I'd like to call now Mr. Duncan Lung to moderate the first Q&A session. Duncan.
Thank you very much, Jelson, and thanks for the introduction there to the different financing modalities from Zara and earlier from Bruce as well. So I'm going to be sort of moderating this session, which is really, the idea is, as Jelson said, to get feedback from you on what you see as issues with our existing policy and also the directions we're going with for the new one. The way we often do this is we will have first off, people who raise their hands can then just come straight in and give us their feedback directly, and then we'll direct the question to the relevant person. Alternatively, you're very welcome to write your questions in the chat. I can then read them out, and then if you've got any further feedback, you can jump in after that if you like. The other alternative way to go is you can send me a direct message or somebody else if you want it to be more anonymous, and then it can be fed back to me as the moderator, who can then put that question to the panel here. So there's a few different options there. The last thing to say as well is, you know, I very much appreciate that there's a lot to have taken in today, particularly if you're not familiar with you know, the different modalities. This is quite a very specific bank thing. And so, you know, if you feel like, well, I need more time to think about this and I need to write back, hopefully you'll have seen the options there to get in touch with us on the side, but we'll also be giving them later. And second, just one last thing to say is there will be a second round. We're going to be talking about financial intermediaries and some other more private sector focused modalities after this first session. So if you've got burning questions on FIs, for example, you might want to wait until that second session is completed so you hear from us first about that. So fortunately, I don't have to fill the silence, and Grant Halber has got his hand up. So Grant, maybe I can turn to you for the first question. Thank you for helping out and coming in with the first question. Thank you.
Duncan, thank you very much. Just want to make sure you can hear me. Okay, great. Yeah, hi, my name is Grant Halber. I am from the Institute for Energy Economics and Financial Analysis. We're a US-based think tank, but globally covering issues in the energy transition. Appreciate you giving me the time to comment. Our comments are, first of all, I wanted to couch these in the context of prior feedback we provided during this process, which is that IEFA sees the opportunity for overhauling the SPS as an opportunity to introduce the principles of the bank's stated goal of being Paris aligned in all operations. And nowhere does that become more relevant than in environmental and social safeguards when we think about energy transition, sustainability, and just transition issues. So we are providing these comments in that context. As you said, these loan modalities are not for the layperson not very obvious, but they're super important. What this really does is allows the way that we see the modalities is it allows the country, the borrowing country, to take full ownership and responsibility for their transitions on reform programs, implementation of those reforms through downstream actions in projects. And but as such, what that does is transfers a lot of responsibility to the borrowing government and away from ADB's control. So as Zara highlighted, the upfront planning on safeguard systems for these borrowings is super critical. And because once the monies are released, it's hard, you can't get them back. And therefore you want to make sure that the monies are being applied for the purposes intended in a way that's sustainable and maintaining the principles of the bank in its SPS, in its energy policy, in its Paris alignment goals. So the challenge we have here is that many of our borrowing governments have worked with ADB obviously for decades, and therefore have these environmental and social safeguards management systems in place. But given the evolution of sustainability in the age of the Paris Agreement, these systems may not currently be aligned with that end goal from an ADB perspective. They may not even be aligned with the own borrowing countries' nationally determined targets or net zero pledges. So it becomes incumbent upon ADB prior to approving and releasing funds to assure that those modifications to safeguards protections are put in place. Particularly with policy-based loans, which are kind of a slippery slope. Policy-based lending gives credit, as I understand it, gives credit for an initial set of reforms that are on a pace that are aligned with the overall program, and then additional funding is provided to move those along. Sometimes these have 2 sub-programs, 3 sub-programs, and the challenge is that once those monies are released, there's an expectation that the following tranche will follow. And that might be regardless of the outcomes. And I think that's the thing that is, the thing that's interesting about these self-managed loans is that there will always be a chance that the outcomes will not be achieved, because some things will be successful and some things won't. So how does the SPS address those areas where deficiencies occur? Do you automatically release funds for a next tranche, even if there are deficiencies? How do you work with the borrowing government to address those deficiencies before additional funds are borrowed? And I think that's really the challenge with these types of loans. It becomes more of a tug of war because it's more hands-on. So we would hope that the SPS here takes advantage of the opportunity to increase the level of sustainability overall in loans, provide, and as Zara pointed out at the end, provide technical assistance, that the bank proactively works with governments to enhance their ESMS systems and other national policies around safeguards to prepare for Paris alignment in line with ADB's lending policies. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Grant, thank you. That was a really great start to the session, and plenty to unpack there, and some really complex issues. I think, you know, our strategy 2030 has been in place for some time, since 2019, and it's aligned with the Sustainable Development Goals, which there's many of course, and some of those, you know, don't always match up. You know, so there's always that challenge, I would say. So anyway, I'm moderating, not responding. So maybe I could turn to Bruce first. Perhaps Bruce, you could come in on, you know, where we sit with the Paris alignment and, you know, the just transition, and where you see the, you know, are the different modalities coming in there. And then perhaps we can turn over to Madhu, who could give some feedback on the results-based lending, and then Zara maybe could finish off in how we want to work with country partners, you know, on the country safeguard systems. So Bruce, over to you first. Thanks.
Great, thanks, Duncan. Thanks a lot, Grant, and good to see you again. You always give us some interesting, thought-provoking pieces to work through, so appreciate that. Yeah, let me try to touch on a couple of things. One, you know, the whole agenda around supporting Paris and the climate change agenda is a big one now for ADB. We're actually trying to realign the whole organization to be able to deliver on that. And that's something we're going through at the moment. Actually, ADB is doing a quite major reorganization where the shift to support climate change is actually one of the central pivots, along with things like increasing engagement with the private sector. And there's some important shifts that we have to move. You know, one is being much more engaged upstream and not trying to just incrementally adjust projects. You know, a little bit of climate proofing here, let's reduce some greenhouse gas emissions on this particular project, because of course that won't get us to the global goals that we have, or certainly not in the time frame that we need to do it. So those more strategic shifts are very important. And we will be, from July this year, working through a process to align all of our operations with the Paris Agreement. That's 100% of the sovereign operations with governments, and 85% initially for the private sector, but next year we'll go up to 100% with the private sector. There are some aspects with some specific programs where we need a little bit more time on the private sector to shift them there, but that will be by next year. So there's a whole lot of upstream work that will be happening, and we're trying to see how also you can focus more on the impact of that. So another shift that we're making through the new operating model that we're looking to put in place is establishing more of an ex-ante development impact framework that we can apply. So, you know, not just the projects you're going to do, or you know, more narrowly defined outputs of a project, but really looking at the impact and the likelihood to achieve the impact, and that's something that we should be screening for upstream. So there's a few strategic shifts there, but bringing it down then in terms of the environmental and social safeguards. So on climate, we're working now through a process to develop a separate climate standard that will fit under the safeguards. And what we're working on, and what's taking quite a bit of conversation, is to see whether that upstream work goes, where that ends, and then where you come in at a project level. Project level for greenhouse gas emissions side, even if you've said, well, we're Paris aligned, we think you still need to do further assessment and monitoring, and look for further opportunities for you know, prevention or reduction of emissions, and looking across that more detailed assessment at the project level. And then while for adaptation and resilience, you really need to be working upstream at country levels, sector levels, landscape levels. You do need to then come into the project and say, well, what's the impact of this project on the landscape or on people, and make sure that you can certainly address it at the project level. So, there's a range of things we're looking to bring into the safeguards. Let me shift now, though, to some of the points that you were making around the lending modalities. And yeah, absolutely agree. Some of the modalities like the policy-based lending, the results-based lending, you're starting to obviously channel money in different ways, and you need to be able to assess whether or not the client's got the management capacity and the systems to be able to do that. And we have got those systems in place with the existing policy, but I think one of the shifts that we need to make is probably enhancing the assessment processes for those. You've got, for example, the policy-based lending. You need to do a thorough job in looking at both the direct and the indirect impacts of a policy reform program. So that's something that we're looking to have made clearer. And as you've said, if you've got several tranches of a policy-based reform program, before you go into the second tranche of it, you do want to look at the achievements and whether there's any issues. So that's another clarification I think we need to make. You're relying on the policy reforms themselves to be delivered. So if you've got a likely environmental or social impact that could be caused by a policy reform, you've got to adjust the policy reform program or build capacity around it to make sure you can manage those issues. And so before then taking that program further, you've obviously got to check whether that's being achieved or whether further changes would be needed. So yeah, I mean the points that you're making are obviously are good ones and certainly resonate. So they're issues that we're looking at, but we'll have to make sure we've got the right provisions in the policy for it. So Duncan, let me pass back to you. I think I've covered a few of Grant's points, but if there's some that we've missed, we want to pass to other colleagues, we can certainly do that.
I think you've pretty much covered everything, and given we've got a lot of hands raised, etc., I think probably better to crack on. So if you're okay with that, Grant, but thank you.
Yes, please, let's get other voices in here. But
okay,
thanks, Grant.
Appreciate that.
Thank you very much. So if we can maybe turn to Knud Voeking. Knud, you had your hand up next, so maybe the floor is yours.
Yeah, so I'm sorry, I have to leave in a minute to host a different call regarding the World Bank presidency. So also a pressing matter, as you can imagine. I have just one remark and regarding the TAs. As CSOs, we time and again see that technical assistance is paving the way for highly problematic projects. And when we tell the World Bank and others that, hey, it's your TA that led to this project, they say, yeah, but we only gave advice, and they washed their hands in innocence. And so I think it is very, very important that MDBs look what kind of consequences their technical assistance may have. And so, well, of course, not the full extent of the safeguards can be applied, but at least there should be an evaluation of possible consequences and a thorough one. Thank you.
Thank you, Knud. That is a very good question and a quick one too. So, Bruce, do you want to jump in on this one quickly?
Sure. Yeah. Well, nice to see you, Knud. And thanks. That was a very clear question. So the technical assistance has been one that we're looking at, and thank you to you and others for raising it during the process. There's a few aspects we're looking at. One some technical assistance can include pilot activities which are intended to test something that could be then scaled up through a larger project. We certainly see that as a legitimate area to look and apply the safeguards and do some screening. Across the wider works, we do a lot of capacity building programs with our technical assistance, which, I think that's intended to basically support enabling conditions. Sometimes though, there is requests for technical assistance that might support analytical work that could feed into borrowers, potential policy reforms, legal reforms, those sorts of aspects. And I understand your point in terms of those could have far-reaching issues, and we, may need to look at some of them for potential considerations. But there are limits as to how far you can apply an assessment framework in those, because it is technical assistance. It's not something we have control over, a legal agreement in terms of how that information is used. It is really up to a client to decide what they do with that information. So I think there's certainly some significant limits as to what you can do there with the technical assistance front. But it's certainly one that we've been considering. So Duncan, I'll pass back.
Thanks very much, Bruce. Hopefully that was enough for you at the moment, Knud, but feel free to also, of course, write to us if you have any more detailed points you'd like to make on that one, because I think it's an important point. So if I can go maybe next to Lad Connell, since you have your hand raised. Lad, nice to see you again. Over to you.
Sure, thanks Duncan, and thanks Bruce, thanks to ADB for hosting this session. I think there are really important issues here. I also appreciated Grant's points and Knud's points, and I just wanted to come back on policy-based lending, because I think it is a really important modality that the banks use. It is very impactful, what happens through policy loans. And Bruce, I appreciate your point that it is important to look at direct and indirect impacts. And we haven't studied ADB's policy lending specifically, but we have looked at the World Bank's policy lending and seen that oftentimes it's especially the indirect impacts which are not taken into account, and that need to be, and that these do have serious impacts on communities, that are hit by sort of secondary impacts. For example, in a land reform that was intended to empower communities, it ended up being used by corporates, to essentially get title to lands and things like that. So, we think that really it's useful to have strong safeguards applied to policy-based lending. And I think it's also useful to consider how these policies can be better harmonized, because I think it does get difficult for borrowers when you have kind of multiple different standards. So I'd be interested in your thoughts on both the harmonization and on how do you safeguard with respect to those indirect impacts. Thanks.
Thank you very much, lads. Very clear. So I think Zara, perhaps you could jump in on these. So harmonization and strengthening for policy-based lending. Any thoughts you might have on those 2 points, perhaps?
Yes, thank you, Duncan. Thank you, Lad. Yes, for policy, what we see that policy-based lending offers a good opportunity to also look at strengthening of country systems as well, and we've definitely looked at that as part of the study that we undertook, and to see if there are if we go upstream at the country programming stage and work with if the operations departments work closely, they're the ones who are working closely with the governments, and at that stage identify if there are certain policies that could be strengthened, then which have implications on environment and social. So that is one avenue that can come through this, and generally on strengthening of systems through this. So this, and also I think for strengthening of country systems, one of the modalities is that can be very useful is the results-based lending, where we have a small a small window through which we can affect change in an institution's safeguards policies or safeguards practices. Bruce, you want to come in and add, please, if you like.
Thanks, Sarah, and thanks, Lad. Nice to see you. Yeah, you hit it right on the head in terms of the indirect impacts. And the sort of example that you were giving is actually quite similar to one that I use in talking to my colleagues in the trainings that we do for our staff. Often we have colleagues doing these policy reform programs, and they say, oh, you know, look, there's no physical works on the ground. There's no civil works activities. So, you know, what's the impact? You've got to explain that, you know, policies can have significant impacts on land. And, you know, I think as we get into the climate space as well, there may be some significant issues to think about, really challenging problems, for example, around sea level rise and storm surge and floodplains and people that are living in those areas, including informal settlers. And is there migration that needs to happen? Is there resettlement that may need to happen? Policies that could shift in that direction would have major implications. So I think that's the area where we need to focus a bit more. The other is programs that might have significant impacts of that nature. I think we can use tools like strategic environmental and social assessment more, but you've got to come in early to do that. And then just strengthening the analytical work in the, we typically use a matrix, as Sarah explained. So, you know, the level of detail that goes into that analysis, you don't need to cover it if there's no risks, but on the issues where there are, I think it usually takes quite a bit of detailed analysis to get the policy right. So I think there's some areas that can certainly be strengthened. Thanks.
Thanks, Bruce. Hopefully that gave you some clarity there, lads. If it's okay with you, I'll turn to the next, some of the next questions. Okay, so we have a few from Kate. I think what we'll try and do, Kate, is we will perhaps try and split these up. The ones that are focusing on FIs, I think we'll take in the next session, if that's okay with you. But I see there's a couple at the beginning which are actually more related to other modalities. So perhaps if I tackle them now, then we can move on to the others afterwards. So the first one relates to PBLs. It is welcome that PBLs is part of the SPS in contrast to the World Bank, where DPF is guided by the operational policy rather than the ESF. This must be retained, expand requirements for evaluation of social and environmental impacts on PBL. So the requirements to evaluate potential direct and indirect environmental and voluntary resettlement impacts on Indigenous people associated with policy actions to be supported by programme loans should be expanded with mandatory specific assessments on, for example, climate change, gender, and so on. So I think that's a very good question. Maybe Bruce, do you want to have first go at that, and then if we need, we can bring in Madhu or one of the other team members here to respond as well. Thank you.
Sure, thanks, Duncan. And thanks for that question. Obviously, a lot of interest in the policy-based lending for good reasons. So I think part of this we've touched on in the previous rounds on this, but you know, one point to add, perhaps explaining what we do and what we can strengthen a bit more. When there's a proposal for a policy reform, we would look at the reform measures, each individual one, as well as the whole reform package, and put a matrix together that would assess the various environmental and social implications against our own standards. So we'd usually sort of break it up into, right now we've got environment safeguards, we've got involuntary resettlement, and Indigenous people safeguards. So you do an assessment against those three areas. Under the new policy, we'll have a set of 10 standards. So it'll continue to include broadly environment, but we're going to split that up into a range of different topics. You'll have the land acquisition, you'll have Indigenous peoples, and you'll have climate in there. So you will have a framework under which to assess, and each one of those standards will have a set of objectives. So you're able to sort of say, well, you know, are the proposed policy measures consistent with those policy objectives that we've got for environment and social issues? Need to do a screening though, as we were saying before, on sort of direct and indirect impacts, and look both, you know, short term and longer term in terms of what's reasonable for the scale of the policy reforms. So it's kind of the way we're handling it now, but I think it's the details in the assessments, as well as potentially using these more strategic upstream tools where possible. So may cover a number of the points. If I missed anything, Duncan, or we want to do another round, we can certainly do that. Thanks.
Thanks, Bruce. I think you covered it there, to be honest. So unless Kate feels like she wants any further clarity, you can always put it in the chat and we can come back to you later on. But we do have a few more questions, so it's probably better that we just keep going. So we have 3 in 1 from Margaret Wachenfeld. So first question relates to the gap assessments between national law and safeguards made publicly available. If not, can you explain why not and whether a summary can be made available? I think we can answer you that one. Good to hear that ADB is working on development impacts. Hopefully this will look at not only positive impacts, but negative impacts as well. So taking a more holistic view of overall impact, but also not trading off negative for positive, making sure that both are gathered into the same framework is a good way to start. So perhaps we can get some feedback on that. And lastly, on policy lending, it would be good to hear whether how ADB is considering issues such as data protection and other possible impacts on privacy, freedom of expression and association when supporting policy changes. That's a very good question, something we've been asked about before. So perhaps maybe I could turn to Bruce to start with, and then if one of the other team members wants to come back in, then they're welcome to jump in at the end there. Over to you, Bruce.
Thanks, Duncan. I'm lucky. Always get so many great questions to talk about. So on the gap assessments, so yes, they are made public. There's a range of ways that we do these depending on what the project or the program actually is. So typically for a project investment, you would have sort of a review of the country's legal framework, and then most projects would then have some analysis of the consistency with our own policy and what are some of the gaps. Fairly high level though, it's just intended to say, well, what are the issues that we might need to go beyond what the current government's legal framework or policy standards are. You know, for example, you pull out a project needs to meet noise standards, and the government might have a lower threshold for noise standards than we might apply. The government might not have a framework for ensuring consent of Indigenous people, but we have requirements in our own policy. So you'd be looking at that sort of level. Then you come to more programmatic approaches. So you've got our results-based lending, and this is something, if we wanted to get more into this, my colleague Madhu Mita Gupta could speak about. She's been working on this a lot. But the results-based lending, you look at what is the program that's going to be delivered, and here we're providing finance not for inputs, but on the achievement of outcomes. So, you know, for example, increased literacy rates in education rather than paying for the construction of new schools. And so it's a different assessment framework. But you would look at the program and the applicable policies and laws, regulations that would be applied to it. And then again, we have a matrix and we put that alongside what we would require in our own policy. We call that a program safeguard system assessment. And that documentation is all published with the program documentation that goes to our board. Country safeguard systems also, we've not made a lot of inroads in this, but we've done a lot of detailed assessment work, for example, in Indonesia, which is all available on our website. So that's there. And we're reviewing again with this financing modalities exactly what the assessments are. But you can expect, in terms of disclosure, for us to continue to follow our access to information policy, which has a presumption in favor of disclosure. So that's the first one. On the development impacts, Duncan, I can speak briefly on that, but it might be good to pass to Mark as well, because he's doing some work on this in the private sector. I'd mentioned it before, and so Margaret's question was positive impacts and should also include the negative. I'd raised some points on this also to my colleagues, because we are at just the beginning stage. We obviously want to focus in on the positive development impacts, but you also need to consider whether or not there might be factors that could counter the achievement. You know, for example, a project that's intending to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by investing in renewable energy, but at the same time is constructing the solar in a forested area and leading to a lot of deforestation. You know, you do want to have a consideration across that, both positive and negative, and pick the projects that are going to have the best development impact. So that's some of the conversations we're having, but it's just a starting process. But Mark Kunze, who's a director in our private sector operations, is looking at some of this for our non-sovereign work. Mark, do you want to speak a bit more?
Yeah, I'll just jump in very quickly, Bruce. We're fortunate to be a little further ahead in the private sector than our sovereign colleagues when it comes to the importance of development impacts and additionality in our project design and selection. About 3 or 4 years ago, the board instructed us that they would no longer be measuring our performance on the size of our deals, i.e. the dollars out the door. Instead, they wanted to see much greater emphasis on development impacts and the additionality that we bring. And obviously, we've had to make a fairly significant change in our project selection processes. And to guide that, we've developed an ex-ante development impact framework, similar to IDB Invest Delta system or IFC's AIM systems. I say similar, but they're not identical. And that is now a very fundamental part of the department's project selection and design process. If a project comes forward that is fairly weak on development impacts or with no additionality, it's very unlikely that we would go forward and do any due diligence and end up funding that. So yeah, so a similar approach is being talked about for sovereign, but it is in very early stages yet. So we're a little ahead there. So just a quick update on what private sector is doing on that front.
Thanks very much for that, Mark. Helpful. It's good to have different parts of our bank is quite big, you know, so that means that people often are pushing each other to do better, which is very helpful for our overall mission, if you like. I think we covered the access to, the data privacy point there as well, Bruce. You already touched on that. So I saw that we had in the chat earlier on a question from Piet, but I think we've pretty much, from Piet Ichben to do with TAs, but I think we've already sort of answered that through Bruce's earlier response. So I think, being conscious of time, unless we have any others that I have missed, I'm sort of curating here at the same time as I'm looking. But I think we can probably wrap up now, go back to Gelson for the second presentation. And then Kate, Oh, Bruce has got one more thing, so please go ahead,
Oh,
Bruce.
Yeah, no, Duncan, I didn't respond to Margaret's question on data protection, but as we've got more to go, while you go on to the next presentations, I'll respond in the chat on that one. And then if Margaret, you've got follow-up later on, we can come back to it. Thanks.
Great. Okay, so Gelson, over to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Duncan. So very good session. But I know that there are questions that came in, and these questions seem to be fit for the discussion following the presentation to the private sector. So we'll save those questions for the second round. But for now, let's have a 5-minute break. Have another cup of coffee or tea maybe, or a glass of water. And then when we return, we'll have Felix to begin his presentation on the private sector. So see you in 5 minutes. So welcome back. We are now going to continue with the presentation of the background study, which was earlier started by Zara. This time, we will have a presentation on the financing modalities in the private sector operations. Again, it's the same approach, a description of what these are, what are the safeguards required under the current safeguards policy, and the issues that are being considered for the revision of the policy. So I will now call on Mr. Felix Oku. He is the Senior Social Development Specialist of the SDCC to lead this session. Over to you, Felix.
Thank you very much, Jelson. Just to confirm, you can hear me loud and clear, Jelson?
Loud and clear.
Excellent. Okay, so welcome to this section, and thanks for that very active and engaging conversation during the Q&A session after my colleague Zara's presentation. This sector is titled Private Sector Operations. We're going to look at the financing modalities or financing instruments that is usually used by private sector operations of the bank. But then there's one that is for financial intermediation, business or transactions that's used by both our private sector operations and in the sovereign arm of the bank. Can we go to the next slide? I'll be talking predominantly about three financing modalities. But before I start that, the SPS has been effective for well over a decade now, became effective 2010. And within that time frame, the whole world has changed, and so has it happened with our private sector operations. Our private sector operations business has evolved and has, within that decade, deployed quite very innovative and new financing modalities, including transactions on the capital markets. So financing instruments such as FIs or financial intermediation work, or what we call financing intermediaries, has been deployed for FI, part of work for banks and non-banks. Our private equity fund part of the business is growing and also quite heavily deploys that financing instrument. That's also been used for quite a few things like our trade and supply chain program. But, a private sector arm of business has not just stopped there. There's been transactions also with, I mentioned, on the capital market, green, blue, and social bonds, sustainability bonds. It's also been gone as far as the issue of IPOs and what have you. Clients have also come to appreciate the development of the safeguards instruments that are required by these financing modalities as a value addition. Mark just mentioned the development impact and what have you, just goes to confirm that corporate entities that engage with ADB now have come to appreciate the value addition of preparing some of these safeguards instruments and how that improves their business and their reputation overall. Next slide. So I'll be talking broadly about three financing instruments, and I'll begin with what I'll call the plain vanilla financing instrument that is being used by the private sector for many, many years and across different spectrums, which is project finance. So project finance is just a structure that I think a lot of you on this call will be quite very familiar with, that structured financing for a specific infrastructure most of the time, but it also goes for business processes as well, where a dedicated project company, usually called an SPV or special purpose vehicle, is created, and the cash flow from that project company or SPV is what is used to service the debt. For project finance, there is an infrastructure one issue project. So it depends on whichever safeguard requirement currently within the SPS is triggered. 1, 2, 3, then the necessary safeguard assessment and management planning that accompanies whichever safeguard is triggered will be prepared. But private sector operations do enter into deals at different stages of the deal's development. In most cases, they would enter in when the development of the infrastructure or business process has already started. And in such cases, then our special requirement for does apply, where existing facilities exist and you didn't have compliance audits or environmental and social compliance audit undertaken on the facility, and where gaps are identified, then a time-bound corrective action plan will be developed. For a category A project, and that applies across board, then the mandatory 120-day disclosure requirement on the ESCA, that is environmental social compliance audit, and any corrective action plan that is associated with it will be disclosed. What are some of the recommendations that have been proposed for the policy update? The SPS in its principle is very front-loaded in terms of the safeguards, the framework, assessment and planning. I think what will be necessary if we take a much, we give a bit more flexibility with the assessment in the new safeguard framework to enable clients to better resource and plan to address issues across the implementation or the life of the project. And if we compare with our comparators, they have such safeguard instrument. The IFC and the institutions that use the IFC sustainability framework deploy the environmental and social action plan. The World Bank, that's the government arm or the sovereign arm of the World Bank group, has also adopted it in, we call it a different environmental social compliant commitment plan. Such a modality would allow the implementation of compliance or safeguards management plan across time, and it will be quite helpful. Next slide, please. So we then go to another financing instrument, which we call general corporate finance, and link very closely with it is corporate finance. It's the difference between the two purely has to do with the use of proceeds from ADB financing. So with general corporate finance, could be debt or equity investment, and is a corporate entity, not an FI. And this is not earmarked for specific sub-projects. So for capital replenishment, as we did a lot for a lot of corporate entities during the COVID pandemic time. And for that purpose is because it's a corporate finance, there is a portfolio approach that is adopted by looking at a corporate audit of the firm's environmental and social management system, the ESMS. We audit the ESMS per the firm's or the corporate entity's business and activities, and where gaps are found between what we think exists with the ESMS and that of the SPS, then corrective action plan are also developed. For corporate finance, which relates to development of specific sub-project or investment in sub-investment activities, then the ESMS is applied to the sub-project. SR1, so safeguard requirement 1 to 3 applies to those sub-projects. An asset class, possibly, it's what is adopted with that. Where there is expansion or rehabilitation, modernization, then the existing facilities comes in, and again, an audit will be done because of the staging of entry by ADB, and where gaps are found, a time-bound corrective action plan. Again, for category A environment, 120-day disclosure period is done. Monitoring is informed by the risk categorization that is assigned to the project. And what are the main issues for consideration? We think a much more harmonized corporate finance instrument will address both the current maybe differences between the general corporate finance and the corporate finance approach, where a general corporate finance as a financing instrument that addresses all issues with debt and equity, and it looks at the use of proceeds, either using a portfolio or an asset class-based assessment will be the best way to go. ESMS will still be the primary safeguards instrument to enable the client to be able to assess the business activities or corporate activities that the use of ADB proceeds are being deployed to. Feel there is a need to make sure that ES assessment is assessed properly with a stronger emphasis on the corporate activities, organization capacity and commitment to implement the plans, and not just the procedures and policies. There is, I mentioned ADB's active participation on the capital market, so that as well needs to be looked at with a lot of limitations and with leverage and as of the time of participation in those capital market transactions. Monitoring and disclosure information has to be done, and there's been a lot that has been talked about monitoring and disclosure of within the private sector operations, but that has to be done within the constraints of what legislative requirements are and sensitivities on the capital market, or what we call market sensitivities with the client. Also taking cognizance of the client's commercial confidentiality with the disclosure of certain kinds of information. Next slide, please. So before we talk about our FI financing instruments, we thought we give a bit of an overview of our existing FI portfolio. So what you see on the screen there, the plot on my left shows the spread of the FI portfolio between our private sector operations and that of our sovereign arm of business. I told you the FI is used by both arms of business of the bank. Well over 70% of the portfolio lies with our private sector operations. And it's quite noteworthy as well that the ID report, which I can see have been quoted already in a question related to FI, did recognize that it's quite been implemented quite very well by our private sector operations. So within the bank, there's quite some kind of knowledge transfer that we could do internally. The plot on the right-hand side seeks to explain the risk portfolio of our FI across the three safeguards. So the first plot you see there is the plot for the environment safeguards. And you can see on the sovereign arm of business, the portfolio is quite really low risk. 50 out of 53, it's category C. We have only two main categories of FI. So there's FI that is treated as FIC, and that is synonymous to category C based project. But we also have FI. So if it's stated to be FI, then it means that it has the capacity to take both category A and category B sub project or sub loans, if you call them so. Only caveat I put on that is that as of now, there are only three main FIs that can take category A sub project, and those we've engaged over an extensive number of years to make sure the capacities have been strengthened, and they've got additional mechanisms in place that is including strengthening of the ESMS's several trainings to be able to undertake and manage those category A subjects. In any way, all category A sub projects for environment or IRs are referred back to ADB to ensure that compliance requirement with public participation and disclosure are ensured prior to project going to board for approval. What you see also there on the graph with our private sector operation shows that yes, our portfolio is increasingly moving away from the category C onto FI, but again, bulk of that portfolio rests with FIs that can only take category B project. Let me restate again that only three at the moment have the capacity to do category. In the next slide, you will see the spread across the other two social safeguard slides. If you move to the next slide, please. So you have the IR, and again, you see on the sovereign side, on the picture on my left-hand side, you can see here that the sovereign arm, it's quite very low risk. And then when you come to the private sector side as well, on the IR side, it's quite greater part of the portfolio is low risk. It's all because the kind of portfolio that is issued from our private sector side is very low risk, typically for micro and small scale medium enterprises, with loan ticket sizes ranging from a couple of thousands to maybe a couple of tens of thousands. And that's the basic nature of the portfolio. When it comes to indigenous people as well, the trend is quite very also similar with the portfolio. Next slide, please. So how do we manage our FI financing modality, and what are the safeguards requirements? I've already mentioned that FI financing modality is deployed for both banking and non-banking. It's also used for our private equity funds and the trade and supply chain financing program. But FI is used for debt, equity, credit lines, and guarantees. I've already seen some question on trade and supply chain finance program, so we'll come to that. Two main categories I've explained. FI means it has the capacity to take both category A and category B sub project. FI treated C is very similar to category C based projects. ESMSs are assessed on the FI, and emphasis again will be on the capacity of the FI and its commitment to implement the ESMs and not just the procedural or policy systems that they have. ADB will conduct an environmental and social due diligence across board regardless to see the adequacy of the existing ESMS. And if it's not, then it will be developed, plus a corrective action, a time-bound corrective action that I'll be doing. Again, for category A-based sub-projects of FIs, they refer back to ADB, and there's our 1 to 3 requirement regarding disclosure are maintained. What are some of the issues that are being proposed for consideration think the ID report made it quite very clear that guidance is needed. Guidance is needed for both the client and borrowers of ADB, and guidance also needed for ADB staff. Guidance on how to screen, categorize project, how to assess adequacy of ESMSs, and guidance on how to report. So I think that will be a critical component of the new safeguard framework that going forward. Disclosure has been a very big one, but again, disclosure will be promoted within ADB corporate information to access to information policy, and also within the context of DMCs or jurisdiction legislative requirement and sensitivities to market. But all should be underpinned by not disclosing the commercial confidential information of clients to make them less sensitive. Harmonization is critical, and most of the time for our FI deals, we do harmonize to make room for, because of headroom restrictions and to prevent overcrowding with our funding. So there's a need to harmonize and make sure that whatever we're proposing is similar to our sister institutions. I'll go to the next slide, please. So I mentioned that the ID report, which has been already referred in one of the questions, did actually note that overall private sector operation safeguard performance for FI work was as good as or better than that for sovereign. So it shows that within ADB as an organization internally, there's a bit of knowledge transfer that needs to happen. I've already mentioned about guidance, and the guidance provide clarity of roles and the need to harmonize. So I'm not going to go over to it, but we've not had issues with, for instance, labor, which I think will be the new standard, should also have labor that will focus on both the FI and its staff, as well as the sub-projects that the FI will be leading on. Second, and next a slide, please, which should be my last slide, I think. So in the spirit of harmonization, we've gone out there to look at our sister institutions, and the choice of the institutions that we've listed here is based upon the business module. So we're a regional bank. But again, for private, we do both private sector and sovereign. So IFC is quite very global and is a leading institution in terms of safeguards framework for private sector operations. The IFC is there, EBRD, IDB, Invest, and then the ones on the left is the European-based development financial institutions. So Propaco, DEG, BII, CDC used to be the name, and others. They form under that category. Broadly, we tend to align in terms of the approach to risk assessment and how we audit ESMSs. A lot for debt, we go with the asset class, and for equity, for general purpose, I think then we go for a portfolio in terms, and that cuts across all the DFIs. Probably maybe it's only the European-based directive, a European-based development financing institutions that tend to take a portfolio approach regardless, and that's informed by a particular European directive. Exclusions on all of us to have it. Double intermediation, yes, possible with additional controls. That happens a lot, probably more with our sovereign than our private sector operations. Where we tend to differ, though, has to do with disclosure requirement for category A based project, or what others call category 1. And as you can see, the ADB is to maintain the 120 policies there for mandatory environmental category A projects, whereas our sister institutions consistently for 60 days. And in category Bs, some even go for 30 days. The next two are just the basis for the policy basis for disclosure of those information. So probably I would end here and then allow some more questions, because I can see some few questions already come out on the FIs. Over to you, Jelson.
Thank you, Felix, for your very instructive presentation. Although I note that we have we use a lot of acronyms, abbreviations here. So maybe we can provide an early heads up when we have another round of consultations like this. So apologies for that, Margaret. But if some are still confused with some of the terminologies used, if you go back to the background study that was shared earlier, you have all them spelled out in that document. So may I now call on again Duncan to restart the discussion. We're now in the second round of the discussion. I know that there are carryover questions from the earlier session. Now is the time to address them at the end. So, Duncan?
Thanks very much, Jelson. Thanks as well, Felix, for the presentation there. So this time, I thought I would be fair to the people who've waited for their questions and go to them first, and then we can go to the hands up after that. So if I start off with the question from Kate Geary. So Kate has pointed out that overall the modalities that ADB has, FI has been the weakest performer according to the IED report. So the question is, what is ADB proposing to do about closing the gap between safeguards promise and what is on the ground in actual, being implemented? IFC has a detailed interpretation note which clarifies how its FI safeguards should work. Does ADB have a similar plan for guidance to be provided, and will it be made public, and will it be possible to be consulted on that? So maybe I can turn to Felix for that one first. Over to you, Felix.
Absolutely grateful, Duncan. And thank you very much, Kate, for that, I think, very, very useful question. I'll start by going straight and saying, yes, we're going to go with the approach with the interpretation note, maybe just to clear the deck right before we start. There are a few things that the ID report mentioned, and key to the observation that you made has to do with capacity issues, provision of guidance, because the SPS was quite very limited in terms of guidance for FI work. We're coming with not a standard, but an annex, which will look at not just the FI as a modality, but all the other modalities that we prepare, similar to what you have currently with our safeguard requirement 4. And in there, it will give provisions like what we have with the IFC interpretation. It's quite very similar, the approach. And it will provide clarity on the roles and responsibilities with our FI business for both the client and the borrower. There's also a suite of guidance that we're going to come out with, because what we've learned as well is that primarily the safeguards instrument has to be the environmental and social management system, which I'm going to be conscious to spell things out now, Duncan. Environmental and social management system, which we mention consistently as the ESMS. But you would agree with me that even with the best efforts, having systems and procedures, without a very strong management commitment and capacity to deliver those systems, then they are as good as non-existent. So there's going to be also a stronger emphasis on assessment of the borrower's capacity, therefore in that case, and their commitment to implement. And where we think there are higher risk projects, there may be the need even to require the support with special consultants to help them do the review work. I have already mentioned that we do have a few other bits and bobs here that our portfolio looks at medium, micro, and small scale sort of financing, a couple of thousands but as we a couple of thousands and tens of thousands. So it won't change the world, but as we look to increase the FI portfolio, then they take a bit more higher risk appetite. I think that will be necessitated. I'm not sure whether I've touched on all the key issues that you mentioned there, but that is what we think needs to be done in the new policy that will go ahead. And then what will happen on the ground is a capacity building program that I've explained. Over to you, Duncan.
Thank you, Felix. I hope that answers the question from Kate there. So the next question we have from the earlier session was from Grant Hauber, and it was to do with trade finance. So the question was, with regards to trade finance programs in a safeguard context, is there a look through to the actual materials, goods, services being imported, facilitated by the trade finance program? And if not, why not? And the example given there is to do with coal or equipment for high impact GHG refrigerants. So we do have somebody who's a bit of an expert on trade finance on the call from ADB. So Lawrence, can I perhaps turn to you to give some feedback on that, about where we are now and where we're looking to go in the future with the policy? Over to you, Lawrence.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Duncan. So Grant, I think the first thing I probably need to tell you is that the trade finance program for ADB is quite new, and therefore we started it off with only low risk projects, and of course with low risk transactions. So it's goods and materials that cannot have inherent that is not going to projects that have potential significant impacts on the environment or social elements. So that's the first thing. So based on this, the way we apply the look through of the risk on environment or social, and that's mainly a lot of that is on labor, child and forced labor, is through exclusion list. So that's ADB prohibited investment activity list, also exclusion based on our energy policy, and some other high-risk goods that are not on PIAL are also added on that, such as exactly as you mentioned, coal. There are other items that we would not support, such as like conflict minerals and other items. So those are on the list, and that's in the agreement with all the partner banks that work with us. But and in addition to that, the program themselves also have automated screening system that have all these items listed in very details with keywords. So that goes through our own checking as well. So in a short answer, it is yes. And we also require the partner banks to provide additional information on items that we feel could have risk, such as, and that for that we apply things like country, goods combination based on child and forced labor risk, etc. And those are listed on our own internal guidance, and we would then ask the partner banks to provide additional information on those for us to be able to support the transaction. These are things like, for example, if we are to support forestry products, then they need to have certification, or palm oil products need to have certification as well. Yeah, so that's in the nutshell. Okay, I hope that answers.
That's a lot of advocacy that your group needs to do with the counterpart institutions.
Yeah.
So hats off to you for doing that. Definitely the TFP is a niche program that has potential for great impact. So just wanted to make sure that that's definitely included in the scope of this review for SPS as a holistic approach.
I mean, these are already implemented, and we are actually expanding the environmental and social support to the partner banks from the program with toolkits and stuff. So TFP is doing a lot of ENS advocacy with partner banks who are, I think, trade programs are where the partner banks don't normally look at ENS risk. Right? So yeah, we are fully aware of that because we can't ignore that from our own program. Okay, thank you. I think, Duncan, you have many other questions, so I'll let you carry on.
Well, maybe just if Grant wants any further feedback on that.
But no, I have stuff to move on to. Actually, some other stuff. Sorry.
Okay, well,
thank you,
Grant.
Thank you.
Thank you. But Grant, the floor is yours if you want to go on to other questions.
Yeah. So I have 3 points. And one is on private sector operations with regard to corporate finance loans and capital market transactions. Something to consider going forward in applying your new framework is, taking a cue from the market. Looking at particularly green bond programs. Clearly what's happening in the market space, whether it's green bonds, sustainability linked bonds, other types of instruments, is that, the ESG frameworks where you have a green bond framework, a second party opinion, monitoring and reporting requirements, and then particularly with the green bonds, have repercussions if those are not met, which in the case of capital markets transactions could be a step up in margin. It could be acceleration in an extreme circumstance, depending on the framework. But I think applying those principles and taking a cue from the market, saying that's something that EDB could do and do well with a well-defined safeguards lending framework for those instruments. So that was just something that came to mind while I was listening to you. Second, but most important, I think, really is in financial intermediary loans, both on the sovereign and non-sovereign side, is really in your new policy is looking at a very deliberate look through to what the use of proceeds are. Now, I understand the pros and cons about this. The whole point of having a financial intermediary is to develop that intermediary's capacity to act independently and in a way that's aligned with the overall intentions of the program. So therefore, having the ADB look through past the intermediary to downstream loans is almost anathema. But the thing is that I see that, particularly if we are looking to, in a Paris-aligned world, greatly expand sustainable investment downstream, the use of domestic FIs is going to be critical, particularly if you can convert that money to local currency financing, and have those institutions, whether they're private or public-private or government-owned institutions that are rolling out complementary finance to sustainable projects, you're going to want those to be high quality. But then there's my third comment, which is there's a human factor element to this, and something that I would, from my IFAS perspective, we think would be important to close any human element gaps in application of these policies. And I'm just going to give an example. As some of you may know, I was bank staff from 2010 through the end of 2016 and at ADB. And I know I've either helped prepare or certainly review a lot of FI loans. And there is a human factor aspect to this. And there's a reason why there's a preponderance of category C projects in FIs, is that it's unwritten. And I'll clarify that this is not a policy at the bank or anything like that, but there's a human factor expert that says stop your review at the end of at the FI. If they have a good ESMS in place, let them run with that, and don't look through too much to the end use, because that slows things down. Everyone has loans to get out and things to do, and the government wants to start working with this, or the private entity wants to start working. But obviously that rush to completion needs to be taken out of that. It's more about applying the principles in practice to achieve the goals that are intended. And so I guess that's the issue here, is that obviously this has to be a very practical policy and able to be applied uniformly and consistently. And you need the time and the resources to be able to do that. But if you do invest in that up front, clearly the intended outcome is to have a consistent, reliable performance in sustainable use of funds. So we would hope that you can look at how these mechanisms are actually going to be used, as well as what's being applied in those mechanisms. So I'll stop comments there. Sorry.
Thank you very much, Grant. So Mark, I guess you can tackle both parts of that question. Well, there's more than
Yeah,
two,
sure.
but go for it.
It was a great commentary because it's nice to be able to respond positively to most of those points. The first one on corporate finance and capital markets and the use of our financial instruments to drive sustainability performance of our clients is something we're very conscious of, and we are now issuing what we call sustainability linked loans, which has exactly that component to it. If you perform, you get your margin at this rate. If you fail, there's a ratcheting scale. So yeah, it's something we're conscious of. I would like to say that, you know, it's been a huge success and we do hundreds of these, but no, it's not yet in Asia. And likewise with green bonds. We are actively trying to encourage the development of a green bond market in Asia Pacific, but it is not getting the traction it should. There is an uptick at the moment, but even so, it's nowhere on the scale of, say, the US or Europe, which is disappointing. But the point you were making about if a green bond is being issued, do we, you know, what level of assessment do we give to the underlying assets, and do we use other people's certification systems? The answer at the moment is no. The current policy won't allow us to do that. We have to do our own assessments, and we do that, and we work with our clients to help them get that certified as well. So we have a sort of a two-pronged approach. One, we must meet our own due diligence requirements to be assured that the assets underlying the bond are what they say they are, and then two, to help the company then get the independent certification, which then gives the bond a bit more credibility. And I take your point about FIs too. You've mentioned there's a human factor there, and we only do a lot of FI clients that look at B and C category type loans, and I think there's a good reason for that, in that the staff in PSOD over the last 10 years have been very committed to our microfinance and microcredit programs, which makes up an awful lot of our work. And to be able to deliver that sort of product, then we're not looking at the level of environmental and social impacts that would warrant a much more rigorous assessment. However, that being said, we don't simply stop our assessments and reviews of our clients at the FI. We do go one step further. I joined PSOD in 2016, just after you left, Grant, so I don't think there would have been any overlap. But we very, around the time I joined, we initiated an audit program for our FI clients, where we take a range of FI clients from our portfolio each year, and we send an independent auditor out to go and check their systems, see how they're working, have a look at the type of loans that they are delivering, looking at the categorization and risk assessment process, and sometimes actually going out and visiting their clients. You did mention resources, and that is probably the one limitation on the program, is that it's the time and money to get people out to be able to do that is probably the limiting factor. But very much take your point there, and I think if going forward in the coming years, our FI business is going to change, then we are going to be looking at a very different playing field, I think. The ETM example, the SPVs that will be used for that will be considered to be FIs. So we will be looking at a very different playing field than we are now. So yes, the points you've made about ensuring we get the systems in place and that we get the human factors right is well heard.
Just one thing I wanted to clarify is I think what we're suggesting on your own use of assessment tools for, I appreciate you have to do your own due diligence. You don't just blindly apply someone else's framework. No institution should do that. Always, you know, that's the warning label on any market-based purchase. You do your own assessment, but you could take cues from that in enhancing or modifying your own internal due diligence to ensure that it meets the sustainability criteria, or have almost a framework agreement with as part of that ESMS approach with an FI or a corporate borrower or a capital markets transaction, that say for an ADB to participate, we're expecting this, and it looks very much like a green framework. So I think that's just one of the.
Yeah, look, I agree, Grant. We haven't gone very far down that road yet. Firstly, because there's an awful lot of indicators out there. There's also quite a lot of variance in the various rating systems. I think there was quite a lot of caution with the Tesla Exxon issue that came out with S&P. So all those factors are means that we're moving cautiously in that direction. From my perspective, and I'm not sure where this came from, you may even have mentioned it in a previous consultation, I'm not sure, but to me, probably the key indicator that we should be looking for on a sustainability level is what are the clients or whatever's underlying the bond, what is it doing for climate change? I think that should probably be the primary indicator now, rather than the full range of ESG indicators. I think you need to have a sort of tier 1 or division 1 indicator, and then everything underneath that.
Well, yeah, and that gets to, well, both on the private, if you look at a given country where that money's going, whether or not it's private or public sector loan, you could have a metric that's measuring against contribution to that country's NDCs or contribution to the SDG overall at a higher level. But that's something that, if they've stated it and you have an impact on it, positive or negative, you can measure against that. So,
yeah, agreed.
Right, thanks guys. That was a good exchange. It's nice to have an exchange rather than being more of a conversation, which is really great. Okay.
One other thing, just one other thing.
All right, one more.
I do appreciate there's a difference between the microfinance program and macro loans. Like you want a very smooth run. You set up a framework for microfinance and then run with it. I appreciate that. Review its progress. But I think it's more when we get to, as you were mentioning, like this ETM type financial intermediary setup, or you have, let's say ADB is going to co-sponsor a green bank at a national development bank level, where there's going to be sovereign money involved, perhaps, that's where this look-through aspect of it and the sustainability and contribution to NDCs and whatever really comes into play. So I think that's something to think about in how an SPS is applied and the Paris alignment integration into that for these bigger potential FI transactions. Thanks.
Thanks, Grant. Yeah, good point. I think that is going to be a growth area. I'm sort of looking at some of that stuff myself, actually, in another context. Right. So we've got another question here in the chat from Margaret, again from Margaret Waschenfeld, which is to do with project finance. So does ADB require ESAPs to be costed and budgeted? And the same question for ESMS. I'm guessing for FIs, not HIs. Sorry, Margaret, you've out acronymed us there, but I'm guessing you mean FIs. So Felix, maybe I can turn to you on that one.
Yeah, Duncan, thanks. Thanks, Margaret. That's a very good question. So the current policy, SPS doesn't use, as I mentioned, is one of the considerations we're proposing for the new safeguard framework. It doesn't use ESAP. That's Environmental and Social Action Plan. But our private sector operations have been many times ahead of the game there. And this is not just on this element. This is also with labor and working conditions. So I've seen a few ESAPs, and that mostly also happens when we're co-financing with other DFIs or other MFIs that use the IFC sustainability framework. So in those cases, yes, the actions within it are costed. The action within it in those cases will not be the main safeguards, preparation of the main safeguards instrument, which our policy requires that they should be prepared up front. We also use, most of the time, I mentioned our time-bound corrective action plans, and those actions within it are costed, and that has to do with the project finance. In the ESMS, again, yes, where we make for FIs, and we stick our neck to make requirement for maybe a dedicated officer to manage the ESMS at the FI stage. That also comes with resource and cost implications, and where we also request for training and other bits and bobs, development of toolkits. In addition, some FIs may have just a policy and some kind of screening toolkit at the time of engagement, that would take them through the entire 8 or 9 elements of the safeguards up to project review, and that also requires some kind of costing items within it. So overall, I would say yes, although one of it under project finance is like private sector, they'd be ahead of the game. Hopefully that answers your question, Margaret.
Thanks, Felix. A good comprehensive answer there. I think often in these things, private sector is leading the way, which is always good. So I didn't offer to people to raise hands if they want to come in with any questions. So now's the time. We don't have any in the chat at the moment, any questions that I have to read out. So if anybody does have any burning questions, please, now is the time to jump in, and we can put you to the panel there. We always have further sessions as well, and the opportunity to write written feedback if you want to give more in-depth answers. So, you know, if you don't feel comfortable today to give a response, or you want to think about it more, there is always the open channels. And at the end of the session today, we will give you the links by which you can then get in touch with us and provide a more detailed response if you would prefer to do it that way. But I will give it a further call if there are any further questions. If not, we can perhaps wrap up slightly earlier. Most of us are based in Manila, so it's past 11 for us now, so we won't complain if we wrap up slightly earlier. Yeah, last round, if anybody has any questions. If not, we may wrap up slightly earlier. Clear as mud, perhaps. Okay, well then back to you, Gelson. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Duncan. Again, for your smooth moderation, and huge thanks to the participants for your very well thought out and structured comments, and also appreciate the exchange there. I think that which really adds value to this consultation. I know that there are more issues and financing modalities that are yet to be absorbed, but you know, the ADB safeguards policy update process is open to receiving further comments even after this consultation. So for now, please stay with us for another 3 to 4 minutes. We'll have 2 more activities, very short, which is a poll. We would like to get your rating on how satisfied you are on today's session. And earlier, and it's being flashed on the screen, there's a link to Menti where you can provide specific comments, recommendations on how we can further improve the way we run consultations, because we want to keep improving to ensure that we are able to facilitate a meaningful consultation, and especially as we move to the phase 3 of this consultation. So, and after that, we will be handing over the floor to Bruce again to give us a wrap of what we have heard from this consultation and to walk us through what to expect in the coming months, especially now that we are about to close the phase 2 of the safeguards review process. So, all right, I think that's what we got from you. Thank you for rating us quite high, 4 and 5 overall. So again, thanks for your very, very good, well-structured, well-thought-out comments and recommendations. On that note, I will now give the floor back to Bruce for his wrap. Bruce?
Great, thanks a lot, Gelson. And thanks again, everyone, for joining. It's a really interesting session. Some great points raised and some good conversations. I was also enjoying that discussion with Grant and Mark. Really helpful. I did notice, actually, Duncan, after you were trying to call out for a last round of questions, there was one additional one that came in from Noel from BirdLife, which was for an update on developing metrics to track climate and biodiversity outcomes. I'll just mention that one briefly. We did issue last year our first climate-related financial disclosures report, TCFD. I can drop a link to that in a second in the chat if you stay on before you log off. We've also got the tracking that we're developing for the Paris alignment framework. We've got a methodology that we're looking to align with other MDBs. That's a work in progress. Biodiversity, I think we've got more work to do. Duncan's one of the people that are doing some work on that, but I think we have more to input there. Perhaps we can, through our relationship with BirdLife, perhaps we can update you more on that at another time. But overall, it was a really interesting session. A lot of valuable comments for us. Things like, for example, ex-ante development impact frameworks, recommendation. We should be looking at not just positive impact tracking, but also the negatives and how you balance that. Comments, suggestions around linking climate change, Paris alignment into the safeguards. We had a lot of discussion in the first part on policy-based lending, noting things like not just direct impacts, but indirect impacts that are critical, and the need to have robust assessments. But if you've got tranches of financing, making sure you're actually checking on progress before you move forward with providing additional financing. We had technical assistance, recommendation that they should be screened for safeguard issues. Quite a bit of talk on financial intermediaries. That was more in the second half. Questions around, a recommendation, I should say, around the need for an interpretive note, which we don't currently have, which is certainly something we're looking at. Also, the need to make sure that you've got uniform application of our policy requirements and the resources to ensure that you can have reliable performance against the safeguards, and kind of noting that there's a lot of small transactions, microfinance that's going into some of those financial intermediary transactions that are pretty low risk, but as you get into more significant ones, and we might be, as was noted with, say, the energy transition, that you certainly need to look at the robust systems in place there. We also had a look in on the trade finance and supply chain finance, how we screen transactions and work with partner banks. We had some recommendations on the corporate finance and capital market transactions. And I think one key recommendation there was around the use of second-party opinions. We also had some points around disclosure, including disclosure of gap assessments, and another point on costing of environmental and social action plans and environmental and social management systems. But that's just a few highlights of the points that we've noted, or I took down myself. But we will make a fuller summary of the session, and we'll make that available. We are putting those summaries as we finish them up on our website. And then just briefly to mention, looking ahead to the future. So we're moving from these consultations. This is the fourth one. We've got one more tomorrow for civil society in South and Central and West Asia. We're then going to be taking the inputs from that and feeding it into further work we're doing on the drafting. And then all going well, and assuming we can get internal agreement on the draft policy, we're looking to make that available in the next couple of months publicly, most likely before our annual meeting if things stay on track. And then, as I mentioned, after that, we'll go for some discussions with our board, and then we'll go back out for consultations through the second half of this year. So, look, thank you. I always enjoy these sessions with you, with this, North American, European group. Always really interesting and helpful recommendations. So I really appreciated your time today. Some of us are heading off to bed, and for the rest of you, enjoy your day. Thanks very much. Take care.